Welcome to a tutorial on Twine. In this video, we're going to look at the Radiobutton macro as part of SugarCube 2.37. So we often want to present different user interface elements to a player to interact with a story in some way. Often we will turn to links, which is kind of the default thing we use, but sometimes we want to get input in different ways, and we have a number of different choices within SugarCube. If we want to allow a user to choose between a number of different options, a set of options, not an infinite number, then we can use a macro called Radiobutton. Now, Radiobutton is different than checkbox, and if you're interested in checkbox, which is choosing between two different values, you probably want to check out the video on that. However, if you want to provide multiple options, generally more than two, sometimes many, but a set of possible options, you probably want the Radiobutton macro. So let's look at the Radiobutton macro in practice. So let's go ahead and pull this up here. So the Radiobutton macro needs kind of two different things to work. The first, of course, is its name, and the things it needs is one, it needs the name of a variable to update. This is pretty common to most of the input macros. They need to know where you put in that data. Where we're putting that data is in a particular variable. Next, it needs to know, well, if the player or user chooses that, clicks on that radio button, what happens? Well, we update example 1 with some other value, in this case sword. Notice that I've got radio button, radio button, radio button, three different options. For each of these options, I've got the same variable, which allows us, or allows a player that is, to choose between those values. And we've got sword, dagger, and shield. So I'm also using this word checked in this last one right here. When we have radio buttons, multiple of them close together, they're called a radio button group. And those provide all of the options that a user or player may choose from to update something. Generally, we want the same variable. So notice example 1, example 1, example 1. So we might alternatively, for a different group of radio buttons, maybe have them choose something else. But for all of those things associated with all of those that single variable, they're all within one group. They are all the options that are available that affect that one variable. So in this case, the variable being affected is example 1. And I'm also using check here because it will set a default value to this group of radio buttons. So because there's now a default, the user has to choose between these things. So let's look at this in practice so it makes a little more sense. Let's go ahead and build and play. So notice we have right here, shield is checked. That's checked right here into play. Checked right here. Comes up right here in shield. Now notice I have to choose between these three. I can't choose anything else. Because it is within a group, and because I set a default value, it forces an interaction between these sets. I have to choose something within this set of values. And whatever I choose, if I go ahead and check values, we see shield. We come back and potentially choose dagger. We see dagger instead. And of course, if we choose sword, we see sword. So the radio button macro forces a selection between choices if you used checked within that set of choices, which is generally the recommended practice. You want to set some type of default value. Notice though that we're providing more than two options. Again, if you're interested in just two options, you might want the checkbox macro, which is different than the radio button macro, which is a larger, generally more than two set of choices, which you have to choose between them. So for radio button right here, we have up to three choices, but we could add more. And for each section of those, a radio button group, the user has to choose between them. Now, if checked is not here, let's look at this and go ahead and rebuild this. Notice I still have to choose one of these, and once I've made a choice, I have to choose between them. However, let's restart. I'm not going to make a choice, and I'm going to click on check values. And it just says example 1. Example 1 now does not have a value. So something to keep in mind when you're working with the radio button macro is you often want to use checked with one of the options to allow that kind of default value, because if you don't, then whatever variable you're using with that radio button group won't have a value, unless that is you've set it ahead of time. Now, on an alternative structure to what I just showed, I could have used the set macro before the radio button, set a default value, and then not use the word checked here. They're kind of two different approaches to using that, but it's important to understand how that works. So the radio button macro allows us to present a number of limited choices to a user or player and have them choose between them. It is generally recommended, although not enforced, to use the checked keyword right here as part of one of those options to provide a default value for that variable. So if the user doesn't interact with any of them, you will already have that value. However, of course, you can also use the set macro to set the value of a variable before the radio buttons and not use the checked keyword. Two different approaches for guaranteeing there's a value when interacting with the radio button macro within SugarCube 2.37. Thanks for watching.